I am also a professor in the department, in the Environmental Studies program. I am going to be moderating tonight, and I'm going to turn this over very quickly because you didn't come here to listen to me. The first part of our evening is going to be with Leslie Haywood. She's going to lead us through a quick writing workshop. So what we're trying to do with the Binghamton 2 Degrees project or initiative is to get people to think about what Binghamton might look like under 2 degrees of warming and what we can do now to prepare or forestall this from happening. And one of the unique things that we're doing with this initiative is that I took a class in climate change in the 1980s when I was an undergrad student. So we've been talking science to people for a really, really long time. And it's kind of, it's not reaching everybody. And so what we're trying to do with this initiative is to also reach people through the arts, through creative writing, through cinema, through visual arts, music, other ways of developing empathy and connecting people to one another. So Leslie Haywood is professor of creative writing and English, and she's going to take us through a quick writing workshop. So this is participatory. And then after that, we're going to turn it over to Molly Patterson, who will be talking a little bit about the basics of climate change, and then after that we'll do a panel where we'll be joined by 2 other professors, Kristen Prior and Adriane Lam from biology and geology respectively, to talk about what this is all going to mean for the Binghamton area. We'll do some Q&A, and then we'll wrap up again with another part of the writing workshop. So with no further ado, Leslie.
Thank you. Does everybody have something to...
You need your little piece of paper to write on. We're gonna go old school here. No, no phone writing. No. Okay, so climate is science, of course, but it's also a story. It's both so abstract and factual, but it's intimately personal. It's everything around us. It's everything we are. It's everything that we could possibly say about it intellectually is also embodied, is also part of our daily sensory experience. So what we really wanted to start to get people thinking about is your own connection to place and the world around you, and where you're from, whether that's here or somewhere else. So whatever it is you think of as home, I want you to start thinking about that right now. Where's my home? What does home mean? That's such an abstract word. Can you visualize it as a particular place? What is home as a place? And is that somewhere in the natural world? Is that somewhere in your backyard? Is it on your front porch? Is it in your living room? Just home as a place for you. And just start thinking about, okay, how am I connected to that? What is this place in terms of sensory detail? So the one kind of writing thing I'm going to ask you to work with tonight is coming up with very concrete, specific sensory details. What does this place look like? What does it sound like? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? So using any of the senses to come up with details that you can write us a description of. You can also draw this. A lot of people are not verbally oriented, but are more visually oriented. So if you'd like to draw this as well, but I just want you to, whatever it is you imagine as your home place, just start writing about that. So this is just free writing, and the only thing that I would really like you to come up with is just some really concrete, specific sensory details about what it feels like, what it smells like. One of my favorite places is in Colorado, where I lived for 2 years when I was 12, and I can still remember the exact smell of the creosote from the ocotillos. I can see the kind of brown, parched dirt, so just concrete details like that characterize your place. So we're gonna just take like 10 minutes to do that. On the purple page.
In mind that place, we're going to start talking about the science behind climate change and how it might affect these places that we hold so dear. So I'm going to first introduce Molly Patterson. Molly has a bachelor's degree in geology from Colgate University, a master's in geology from Southern Illinois University, and a PhD in geology from the Antarctic Research Center, Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. She did postdoctoral work at UMass Amherst and joined us in 2016. Okay, good. And is now an associate professor in earth sciences. Her research, and I'm only going to say the words that in her research statement that I can pronounce confidently, because there are a few that I'm not so sure about. Sedimentology, paleoceanography, and paleoclimatology. So turn it over to Molly.
Thanks, Pam. All right, so just to follow on that a little bit is I was asked to give a little bit of a background on some of my research, and one of the main projects I have going on right now, and another hat I wear, is I'm one of the coaching scientists for this project titled The Sensitivity of the West Antarctic Ice Sheet to 2 degrees Celsius. So kind of similar theme to this workshop. But the whole kind of initiative of this project is really an international multidisciplinary initiative to better constrain some of the uncertainties in estimating what Antarctica's contribution will be to future sea level rise. One thing I hope you kind of get from a little bit of my talk is that what happens in Antarctica has a really big impact for us here in New York. But I'm mostly going to cover some of the basics, and I'm going to start off with this nice animation that came out from the Goddard Institute of Space Studies, and it really highlights these monthly temperature anomalies relative to baseline interval of time between 1951 and 1980. You can see when in times, prior to that interval of time, you have a lot of blue circles, and that represents colder years. As you get to kind of into that 1951, 1980 time interval, some of those circles start to turn white because they're kind of in line with the average of that time period. Makes sense. But as the years start to progress outwards from that time interval, the circles start to become red, right? And that's really highlighting the year-round warming that has occurred since that period of time. And I just think this is a pretty nice animation, and it kind of highlights that there is these yearly trends that already are extending to about a degree warming, 1 degree Celsius warming. So I thought I'd also start here by just giving a little bit of background on why we care about 2 degrees Celsius, okay? So 2 degrees Celsius really marks a threshold that was identified by the international science community as kind of this threshold that if we keep global warming below this value, it's going to prevent this dangerous interference with the climate system, meaning that if global mean temperatures exceed this amount, there's going to be more floods and droughts, wildfires, and extreme changes and things like sea level. So and that 2 degrees Celsius is relative to pre-industrial values, another baseline, but 1850 to 1900. But the challenge behind reaching this goal of 2 degrees Celsius is that at the current rate of CO2 emissions, we'll reach that warming by the year 2035. So this is a major kind of societal challenge here to adapt to this. One of the main kind of bodies that puts out a review of the modern state of the climate system is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The authors that contribute to this are actually selected from the science community. Okay, they're identified by their peers. The science community can provide feedback on this report before it's published. And one of the latest reports came out this last year, the sixth assessment report, and it basically stated that human-induced warming reached approximately 1 degree Celsius. And that's related to the pre-industrial baseline. So, you know, I always like to think about baselines and what things are being measured against, but that animation I showed you before basically, again, highlights that. But I really like this figure here. And it's really highlighting this period of, you know, warming coming out of that baseline interval. And then you have these different scenarios. You have a future emissions scenario, you know, very high values versus very low values. The low values, you have less warming, maybe year 2100 versus, and high emission scenario warming increases. But really what caught my attention to this figure, and I think it's kind of brilliant, is that what's documented down here, right? So, sorry. My mom was born in 1950. That's not a lie, I promise, right? I was born in the 1980s, and my daughter was born in 2020, okay? So kind of putting it into perspective of, you know, what my kids are going to experience by the time they're, you know, 70 years old is something I actively think about on a daily basis. Okay, so this is just a little bit of a summary about some of the projections, and where some of these projections that I'm going to present to you kind of come from. There's, you know, international reports like the IPCC report that really focuses on global changes. There's some regional changes, but there's national assessments that happen. That's basically through NOAA and NASA, but some of this data goes into those international reports, but also feed the regional and local reports. Okay, and the latest one that came out was the New York State Climate Impact Assessment. And so I'm going to present some of their future pathway scenarios that came out of that, as well as some of the studies that fed into that report. This report really focuses on two kind of future pathway scenarios. Okay, you have, and these different pathway scenarios are really a balance of between societal adaptation and societal mitigation. Okay, there's an extreme version referred to as the fossil fuel development path, right? Or you can think about it as the high emissions path. Okay, and then there's the this kind of scenario, the middle of the road path. Okay, this and these two pathways, you know, it's kind of this balance between adaptation and mitigation. But if you look at, you know, down here, this table kind of highlights the different, you know, global mean temperature estimates for these different time intervals for these different pathways. So for each one of these pathways, by the year 2100, global mean temperatures exceed actually 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, and I think that in part that's because these are the most kind of realistic pathways in the future. So typically we talk, you know, we often relate CO2 to temperature changes, and I'm an earth scientist. I'm not, you know, really focused on the next 100 years. I like to think about on time scales much longer than that, okay? And that provides some perspective. That provides actually some really important perspective on what we're witnessing now. So this graph here is showing atmospheric CO2 changes in the last 800,000 years and Antarctic temperature changes. This is a record from ice cores that were recovered from Antarctica, and those ice cores have bubbles of gas that record what the ancient atmosphere was like and what the associated temperature change was like. And the point here being that in the last 800,000 years, when we've gone through these extremes of cold to warm periods, atmospheric CO2 has never exceeded about 300 parts per million, okay? And typically these periods of time where atmospheric CO2 is higher, you know, you have warmer temperatures. Where it gets lower, you have colder temperatures. And that's a pretty consistent relationship, right? And the other thing that this is really highlighting is it's really highlighting the natural variability of the Earth system for the last 800,000 years and how much we've deviated away from the natural variability. Another way I like to think about this, and this kind of aligns with a lot of the research I do, as well as Adriane Lam does, is that in order to find time periods in our most recent Earth's history that are analogous to where we're at now or where we're headed, we actually have to go back 3 million years in Earth's history, back to this period called the Pliocene. During the Pliocene, atmospheric CO2 was above 400 parts per million in the atmosphere, but also, more importantly, maybe temperatures were in this range between 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial values. So it's a part in Earth's history where the equilibrium state, or the interactions in the climate system, you don't have the human input, but also is very analogous to this kind of middle-of-the-road scenario. So there's a lot of work in the geological community to better understand these past warm periods in order for us to better understand the interactions between the different components of the Earth system. Okay, so this is some observational data, right? This is looking at global mean temperatures. And the point here is just that, you've had this baseline increase since relatively the 1980s. The anomaly here is based on that 1951 to 1980 baseline that NASA uses. And it looks extreme, but when you compare it to the New York temperature anomaly measurements with the same baseline, using the same baseline, you can really see that the New York temperatures are much more extreme, right? And that makes sense because we have really exaggerated seasonal changes here in New York. But you still see that increase in the baseline. And the New York temperature, the more recent New York temperature anomaly is greater than the global average. And then you can bring this down to kind of the county level, right? So Broome County, right, we kind of sit in this nice little sweet spot in New York State, where we have much warmer temperatures in the southern part of the state versus colder temperatures kind of in the northern part. So we kind of, the Broome County values kind of sit below kind of the state average. But then Binghamton is already above, here in Binghamton within Broome County, right, we're already above 1 degree Celsius. And that makes sense to me, because I drive 40 minutes up from the north every day, and I live in Broome County. It's much colder when I get in my car in the morning versus when I get here. I have to take a jacket off or something, because it's a little bit warmer. So here in Binghamton, we're already at about 1.3 degrees Celsius. So what does this mean for the future? So I've taken the regional projections from New York State, and those are done within the region, and they're reported based on like the southern tier, which Binghamton's a part of. And so you have the different pathway scenarios, right? You have that kind of high admission scenario versus the middle of the road scenario. And the point here being is that really by the 2040s, Binghamton will surpass that 2 degree threshold locally under both high and low emission scenarios, right? And the average summers will be 2 to 3 degrees warmer, and winters will be 2 to 3.5 degrees warmer. So another way of thinking about that is that what we have here is observational measurements of temperature change through these years, right, in Fahrenheit now. Value that we think probably more about in our daily life, right? But for both, high and low admission scenarios, the coldest winters of our future will be like the warmest of our past, okay? And the hottest summers of our future will be, the hottest summers of our past will be the coldest, right? The hottest summers of our past will be colder than the coolest summers of our future. And this kind of plays into this idea of climate migration, in that for kind of these high and low emission scenarios, that basically upstate summers could feel more like South Carolina or Georgia summers. So it's probably not a surprise to you that the Northeast receives a lot of precipitation, right? And again, in terms of Broome County where we live, we kind of live in this nice little sweet spot between less precipitation into the western central part of New York versus more precipitation in the south and in the northeast. And you can look at what's happened in terms of precipitation anomalies or variability since, basically 1900. All this data is available through NOAA, and what's kind of striking is that there's this increase in magnitude of change between precipitation extremes that's existed. So I have Binghamton plotted on here in black, and the Broome County anomaly also plotted on here as blue. So over the past 40 years, annual precipitation has increased, and it's increased at a rate that pretty much aligns with the rest of the rate over the Northeast. And the Northeast also has seen more intense multiple day events in terms of precipitation compared to most other regions. So that kind of follows that same path. These are the two pathway projections, right, for precipitation for both based on the Southern Tier kind of regional report, and right, they both highlight are projecting increases in precipitation, but they also project increases in the amount of extreme changes, right? With more precipitation, you're also going to have more droughts that occur, and that precipitation more intense precipitation might come in short, abrupt bouts, which could be a major risk for farmers, especially people in kind of these low-lying, flood-prone areas like us here in Binghamton. So total precipitation during the wintertime is supposed to increase, right? But snowfall is supposed to decrease. So with warmer temperatures, increasing temperatures, you're going to get more rain and less snow for both kind of scenarios. All right, so I know we don't live by the coast, but this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and so I figured I'd give a little bit of a short kind of overview on this, and also because here at Binghamton, we get a lot of students from the coast. We get a lot of students from Long Island. One thing to think about is what happens along our coastlines could have an impact here for us even locally. And it might not be a direct with flooding, but it could be financially. But one thing I want you to know is that sea level rise does not happen uniformly across the planet. There's regional changes. Sea level has been rising globally at a rate about 3.3 millimeters per year, and that's primarily right now from the melting of mountain glaciers, large ice sheets, and the thermal expansion of seawater. The seawater is expanding as it gets warmer. And for the kind of two scenarios that we've kind of been talking about, global mean sea level is estimated to rise by about 0.5 to a meter, and New York might experience actually a greater amount than the global mean for all these model scenarios that are put out there. You see this nice kind of blimp up here in red, darker red for all those scenarios. The largest uncertainty in sea level projections actually comes from a lack of understanding of what Antarctica is going to do, okay? Not necessarily Greenland. Greenland's been the primary contributor to sea level rise, but that's really important for us here in New York, okay? When Antarctica loses ice mass, it actually contributes to higher sea level in the northern hemisphere compared to when Greenland loses ice mass, that contributes to sea level rise in the southern hemisphere, and that's because of a gravitational effect, and that happens in line with the changing of ice mass. So, this is a study that was kind of put out, but I really like these diagrams. They're basically highlighting if you lose 7 meters of ice mass from Greenland, that really only accounts for about a 2-meter sea level rise for us here in New York. Whereas if you lose 7 meters of sea level equivalent from Antarctica, from parts of West Antarctica or some of these basins that are in contact with the ocean, sea level could rise at a much higher rate, about 9 meters. Okay, so what happens in the southern hemisphere actually has a bigger consequence for us here in New York. And sea level has been rising, off the coast of New York. This is data from the Battery or the tip of Manhattan, And it seems like really small incremental rises, right? And it is pretty much in line with the global average. But these seemingly small increases have a really big impact when you have major storm events that hit the Northeast. So this is an example, right, of photos of flooding that happened during Superstorm Sandy. I've got a lot of students in my office who have talked to me about what they experienced then. And the graph down here is really highlighting in green, which is about 4 meters, all right? So, I mean, that's pretty extreme. That's 4 meters of sea level equivalent will be melting sectors of West Antarctica, but also getting contributions from places like from Greenland. So there's a really big financial cost, right? And here us in New York, we experience these big billion-dollar disasters during winter months and summer months, right? Hurricane Sandy is a great example of a billion-dollar disaster. It cost over $70 billion to clean up. And the number of billion-dollar disasters, right, has been increasing, right, pretty dramatically. And the annual cost of billion-dollar disasters has also been increasing. I just kind of highlighted Sandy, the 2012 kind of Hurricane Sandy event here. And it's something I think about as a scientist because of my interests, right? But also as somebody who lives in Broome County. There's regional effects, but there's also effects that happen to our state that could affect our region. So the last thing I'll kind of leave you with is, I know people have said that there's, people get nervous about uncertainty. In terms of, the science, yes, there's some stuff we don't know, but we do know a lot, okay? And really the uncertainty in future climate change is which pathway we're going to go down. And kind of putting closing some of those knowledge gaps on some of those processes that might drive the system in a certain way. And I really like this animation. It's basically highlighting, what global mean temperatures might look like if we meet that 2 degree Celsius threshold and meet the Paris Agreement. Yes, there's some places that will experience warmth, but it's not as extreme as, that kind of high emission scenario. So really the uncertainty is in the path we choose forward as a society. It's not in the science. Okay, that's all I have.
Thank you very much. So I'm actually going to, when we get to the Q&A, I'm going to have people write their questions down and pass them to the GA. So actually, I'm going to have you, and we're modeling reuse. So these are old little memorandums. It says to senior staff from President's office. Way back in the day, this is how we would send paper memos around to people. We have stacks of these in the President's office, so I figured we should reuse them. But if you have questions along the way, write them down and we'll collect them. If we don't get to all of your questions, we are going to put an FAQ page up and we will answer questions, and everything that we talked about today will be online. Okay, so now we're going to turn to our other two presenters. Okay, here's my notes. Okay, good. So joining us now are Kristen Prior. Kristen has her bachelor's from Western University and a PhD from the University of Notre Dame. She did postdoctoral work at the University of Toronto and the University of Florida. She also joined us in 2016. Yes, okay, good. And is an associate professor in biological sciences. Her research is in community ecology, species interaction, and environmental change. And Adriane Lam did her bachelor's in geology from James Madison University, master's in geology from Ohio University, and a PhD in geosciences from University of Massachusetts Amherst. She joined Binghamton University in 2020 as a postdoctoral research fellow and is now an assistant professor in the Department of Earth Sciences. Her research is in paleobiogeography, paleoecology, a couple things I don't know how to pronounce, so we're skipping over those, paleoceanography, and science communication. So, sorry. I am going to start off the Q&A with a question for Kirsten. So, as a biologist, you've seen all of this, we've talked in advance. What impact will all of this have on our local ecosystems?
Great, thank you, Pam, and thank you for the introduction. So as Pam mentioned, I'm an ecologist, which means I study questions about where organisms live, where biodiversity occurs, and why it occurs in those certain areas. In my lab, we are mostly interested in how various kinds of anthropogenic change affects biodiversity. So we study how climate change affects biodiversity, but also how land use change and invasive species might affect biodiversity. We do a lot of cool things in our lab, so we spend a lot of time out in the field, sampling organisms up and down both the east and the west coast. We perform manipulative experiments to ask questions about how biodiversity and organisms are going to change under anthropogenic change. And we use molecular tools and quantitative tools to try to tease apart some of these sort of complex interactions and effects. So now I'm going to answer the question that Pam posed. So the question is how is climate change going to affect natural ecosystems? And so we know that climate change is going to affect people directly in many different ways, right? With more extreme events, climate events, for example, things like flooding or more hurricanes or forest fires can directly affect people. But climate change is also going to affect nature, that then can indirectly affect society and people because we depend on nature. Nature provides many ecosystem services and functions that depend on people. And how nature is affected by climate change is going to feed back to affect people in various different ways. So climate change is going to affect diversity and is affecting biodiversity in really complex ways. That's because biodiversity is complex. Not all organisms are going to react the same way to climate change. They're all going to react in different ways. There might be winners and losers under climate change. A loser might be species that are adapted only to certain areas and might not be able to move successfully under climate change. Winners could be species that might be adapted to various different climates or tropical climates that might be able to move under climate change. Sometimes these are invasive or pest species. And climate change is going to affect biodiversity in many different ways, as I mentioned. So it might cause species to go extinct, move their ranges, or even more complex, have altered interactions or altered timing that could have complex effects of ecosystems. So climate change is not just going to affect biodiversity and the species that live here, but as I mentioned, biodiversity provides many important ecosystem services, and so shifts in biodiversity are also going to cause shifts in those ecosystem services. For example, climate change might affect biodiversity that provides provisioning services such as food or resources to people, or regulating functions or services. So for example, climate change might affect forests that are important carbon sinks that could then also feed back to influence climate change, or species that might be important for, say, flood control or creating clean water. Climate change could also affect species that are important for our well-being. So it might affect species that are important for tourism or creating jobs. So what about in New York? I'm only going to talk about a handful of things that might be happening in New York because, again, there's complex ways in which our ecosystems are being impacted. So as Molly pointed out, in New York, we're really going to have warmer winters. Warmer winters are going to cause less snowpack, earlier springs, and more extremes, including in precipitation events. And all of these are going to have complex effects on our local biodiversity and the important services that biodiversity has here in New York. Here is an example of earlier spring happening. So this year, spring was about 20 days earlier, as estimated by this National Phenology Network that uses aerial photography data to be able to measure leaf out. So leaf out across the nation was 20 days earlier in the east, and particularly so up here in the north, but later in the west. And this has been a trend, if you go onto this website, this has been a trend that's been happening over decades, earlier springs. Why are earlier springs bad? Earlier springs are bad because they could affect the fitness of organisms that might be adapted to particular climates. So for example, this year, something that's important to us in New York are apples. Some of the local orchards are reporting that they have a 30% lower yield. So right now is the time for going out and apple picking, but it's not going to be a great apple picking year. And that's because apples and many other fruit trees flowered earlier this year because it was an early spring. When plants flower early, that means that they might be more susceptible to cold events that also happen in the spring. So the flowers died or the fruit had some frost damage, and meaning that was bad for apples. And we've been seeing this more frequently, again, over the past decade. Other complicated effects that might happen is that species are not going to respond similarly to earlier springs. So for example, apples rely on pollinators, and this year their flowers came out earlier than the pollinators, which also is contributing to low fruit yield. Pests can also be affected by sort of mismatched timing. So a major pest of apple is the apple maggot fly, and it has complex interaction with biological control agents or parasitoids. None of these things are responding the same way to earlier springs, and all becoming out of sync. So another way that climate change is affecting organisms or biodiversity is that it's changing where species can live. So study by the New York Natural Heritage Program from the Department of Environmental Conservation estimates that about 56 species that currently live in New York might not be able to live in New York under warming climate, so they're vulnerable to climate change. And these are some of the species here, including over hundreds of migrating bird species that rely on wetland and coastal ecosystems in New York that are endangered due to climate change. Whole ecosystems might move. So right now in New York, the major forest biome that we have here are maple beech birch forests, and those are expected to be out of New York in the future and replaced, and we're already seeing them being replaced by more hardwoods such as oak and hickory. That's important not just for the organisms that live in that forest, but these also provide important ecosystem services, so they're really important sort of hydrologically in the area, and so might have sort of larger impacts. One tree species that is in danger of leaving is an economically important one, sugar maple. Sugar maple is expected to move out of New York under climate warming, which also means that the optimal production area for maple syrup might be in Canada and not in New York. So climate change is affecting where species can live, and unfortunately that also means that species are not just leaving New York, but they're also coming into New York. And these species are often species that come from more warmer areas, or might be invasive species that have come from tropical areas. So the hemlock woody adelgid has been moving northward, likely in response to climate change, and has now been in this region for the past decade or so, is having large impacts on hemlock trees. That's can have really cascading impacts on ecosystems. A new invader that people are probably hearing a lot about, the spotted lanternfly, is a tropical insect that we don't really know how it's going to be affected by climate change, because right now it's just becoming established in the region and it's spreading. But it's predicted that it is going to spread more under climate change because it does really well in warm conditions. And this species is a pest on lots of crops that we care about here in New York: grapes for winemaking, apples, cherries, and hops. Disease on organisms, unfortunately, might be doing well under climate change as well. So the map on the top is the presence and abundance of deer ticks, which cause Lyme disease, of course, in 2000. And you can see that the deer tick is moving north. The bottom graph is in 2015, due to warming climates and becoming more prevalent. Finally, we know that climate change is also affecting the frequency of extreme climates. This is having major effects on many ecosystems and important ecosystem services, flooding out agricultural crops. We have more harmful algal blooms, which is the picture in the middle, due to floods, more pollution and runoff. that's having major effects on aquatic ecosystem and tourism, such as fishing. We know what happened this summer, that we had sort of bad pollution from lots of fires up in Canada, but it's actually predicted in this region that the frequency of forest fires are also going to increase by 20 to 30%. So we definitely haven't seen the end of that. Also in agricultural systems, we know that dairy cows are one of the major agricultural industries here in New York, and cows don't do well under extreme heat, and it's reducing, extreme heat events have been reducing milk production. So farmers are having to adapt by, putting cows air conditioned farm, which costs a lot of money and might also, increase climate change. So these are a handful of stories of how climate change will be affecting natural systems and those services they provide in New York. But it's a big topic with a lot of other cases. And so I urge you to look at the New York Department of Environmental Conservation's website, have a lot of great information about how ecosystems are being impacted.
Maybe that's one way we'll get across, this across to more people. Like your wine may be affected. We're trying everything. Okay, so a question for you, Adriane, and then we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience. This is something you hear all the time, especially on social media, YouTube, other places. Aren't climate fluctuations normal and natural?
Thanks, Dan. So I'm Adriane Lam, an assistant professor in earth sciences here at Binghamton University. I'm the PI of the ALO lab, Ancient Life, Oceans, Environments. And that's what my lab studies. We're paleontologists, we're paleoceanographers. So that's me, this is my lab group. Actually, that's from last year. I have new members now, and our lab is growing. I look a lot at diversity within the mid-latitude regions. These are areas that are highly affected by climate change today and projected to change in the future. I also study deeper time. So about 400 million years ago, when I look at the organisms during that time and how they responded to ancient climate events, especially around mass extinction intervals, to see how their diversity changed as well. One of the big things I work with are these marine plankton called foraminifera. They're the cutest things ever, and if you disagree with me, I will give you a dirty look. They're single-celled marine protists, and my lab and I, we differentiate who's a species and who's not. So we're doing a lot of work there, and we also use a lot of chemical proxies. That's what this wild figure is on the right side of the screen, by these squiggly lines. Different chemical proxies to reconstruct one of these major western boundary currents in the Pacific Ocean, the Kuroshio Current in extension. That's analogous to the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, let me fast forward a little bit here. So this is a question I get asked a lot as a science communicator, and I should have said that. I'm also a science communicator. I have a nonprofit. I was co-founder and co-creator of a nonprofit organization called Time Scavengers. So we have a lot of informational pages on that website if you want to check it out. It's timescavengers.org. Or just send me an email, I can point you towards there. But one of the big things I get asked by a lot of people who are learning about climate change is, hasn't carbon dioxide concentrations changed through time, and haven't they been higher in the geologic past? And the answer is yes and yes. So, on the right side of the screen, what you're looking at is this figure from Mills and others that they published in 2021. Panel A at the top are just different periods of time and what our Earth looked like. Panel B is what I want to draw your attention to. That's atmospheric CO2 in parts per million. So all of those different colored dots on that screen are just different proxies or different natural recorders of climate that we use to reconstruct ancient climate shifts through time. So you can tell that way back in like 500 million years ago, atmospheric CO2 was in the thousands parts per million, so really much higher than today. However, the species were okay. The Earth's biota were totally fine. We didn't have these major disasters that were happening. And I'm going to show you why that was. And in fact, I'll even point out that one of the Earth's biggest biodiversification events happened under an Earth's climate, so around 430 million years ago, and there's a map up there, it's the second one from the left, under really high atmospheric CO2. So what's going on? Okay, so I want us all to think about the ocean. And I want to talk about the ocean as kind of like an onion, but, layers and all. But we're going to talk about the ocean as having only 3 layers. So the first is the surface ocean. In this schematic, that's the really light blue layer at the top. It's the skin of the ocean. And it's really warm compared to the rest of the deep ocean. This part of the ocean also feels mixing from winds. So it is in contact with the atmosphere in which we live, in which we breathe gases. And it's a zone that also is experiencing heating and cooling, evaporation, and precipitation. The second layer here is the deep ocean. So that's the majority of our oceans today. This is a place that's much cooler compared to the surface ocean. It does not feel any effects from the atmosphere. It is out of contact with the atmosphere. And at the very bottom of our seafloor, there's different types of sediments that are there. And there's all types of different sediments that cover our ocean floor. A lot of them are made of the shells of those marine plankton that I work with, the cutie plankton foraminifera. And those are made of calcium carbonate, or what we call limestone. It's what the rocks around here, Binghamton, are made of. And some of those are also made of silica, so quartz. This is just a map of the different types of seafloor sediments that we have on our global ocean. This is a simplified map. They're actually way more complicated than this, but even I look at the complex maps and can't comprehend, so we're going to simplify it. So all of this darker green color, those are terrigenous sediments. They come from our continents. The red are clay. Those are also wind blown into our oceans. They're in the deepest parts of our ocean. The green is calcareous ooze, so that's stuff that's calcium carbonate. Those are the tests of our little plankton that I work with. And there's also the yellow. Those are siliceous oozes. Those are mostly made of the tests of these silica. They're protists that make their tests out of silica. So what I've also put on here to represent each of those four sediment types are deep sea sediment cores that have been drilled over the decades using a ship. Molly and I both do this. We go out in the sea for about 2 months at a time. We drill sediments, and we use these sediments and the fossils they contain to reconstruct Earth's ancient climate. So you can see that these seafloor sediments look very different. And notice that the calcareous oozes, the one that's very white and fluffy looking, it's white and fluffy looking because it contains all of those shells of the plankton that are white in color due to the calcium carbonate. Okay, so now I'm going to walk through how the surface ocean mixes with the deep ocean and how kind of the chemistry of this all works. So again, our surface ocean is the skin of the ocean. It's very warm. The deep ocean is very cold, so there's a big density difference. But I'm not going to get there just yet. So our surface ocean is constantly in contact with the atmosphere. It always exchanges gases with the atmosphere, and it will come to equilibrium with the gases in the atmosphere on a timescale of about 10 to 100 years. So pretty sudden. So this is significant on human timescales. But if we think about the deep ocean, because there's such a density difference between the surface ocean and the deep ocean, that warm water doesn't want to mix with that cold water. It doesn't mix very easily. So it takes about 1,000 years for that surface ocean to mix with the deep ocean. That's a time scale that is insignificant to humans. Like, that's not going to happen on any one of our lifetimes, right? That's really long. And then the deep ocean can actually buffer itself from becoming too acidic by then acidifying some of those sediments on the seafloor. Unfortunately, it's the calcareous ooze or the carbonates, so those beautiful little plankton that I love and we study. But that happens on a time scale of 1,000 to 100,000 years. So let me state that again. From the surface ocean, mixing with the atmosphere is pretty kind of instantaneous. But when you think about the whole ocean mixing, that happens on a time scale of 1,000 to 100,000 years. So that's a lot. So our oceans have a really, let me back up one. So our oceans have this huge buffering capacity, meaning it can take in a lot of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and CO2 that we talk about with respect to climate change. It can take in that CO2. There are these chemical reactions that happen, and then the ocean itself can buffer from becoming too acidic. That's why ocean acidification, and sometimes in the geologic past, when CO2 was much higher, wasn't a big deal, and our calcifying organisms were okay. They could deal with it. So the problem today is it's a rate problem. We are putting a huge amount of CO2 into the atmosphere faster than the oceans can deal with it and buffer against it. So again, that buffering takes about 1,000 to 100,000 years. Our oceans have a huge buffering capacity, but we are putting CO2 into our atmosphere and methane too fast for our oceans to buffer against that at a reasonable timescale that will affect us and matter to us. So we can't wait that long. And this is also why in the geologic past, why atmospheric CO2 has been in the thousands of parts per million. It happened at a slower rate, our oceans could buffer it, it was no big deal. The atmosphere and our oceans were in harmony and in equilibrium. If you're really into chemical equations, you can talk to me. I think we can all agree that chemistry, it's a little late in the day for this. So let's not. But you can talk to me after if you really want to look at chemistry. Okay. So the oceans have absorbed about 30% of all CO2 that we have put into the atmosphere. That's led to about a 26% increase in acidity. And the rate at which we see ocean acidification happening today is actually unprecedented. We don't see anything like that in the geologic past. So humans are really doing a number here on our oceans. So again, our oceans simply cannot keep up with the rate of CO2 emissions that we have been putting into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. It does have the ability to buffer that. It will eventually buffer all the CO2 in the atmosphere that we put into it. The Earth will be fine. The organisms, as Kristen was talking about, will suffer. But again, that's on time scales that may be like 100,000 years. That's too long. There's one other point I want to make, and I want to talk about human evolution for a minute. So now I'm going to go into my paleobiologist mode, come out of my paleoclimatologist mode. So our ancestors began to evolve about 6 to 7 million years ago, and what you're looking at is this figure from, I believe this one's the Smithsonian website. So we are part of the genus Homo, and you can see the Homo group that's up there. So those are our ancestors, and those are us at the very top, Homo sapiens. So the genus that we belong to, we began to evolve around 2 million years ago. That's when we first appear in the fossil record. Homo sapiens, our species, what we are, we only evolved 300,000 years ago. Geologically speaking, that's like really sudden. This is just another figure from that Smithsonian website about human evolution. I want you to pay attention. What this thing is. There we go. Okay, this is the benthic foraminiferal oxygen 18 curve. Let me break that down. Benthic foraminifera are the protists that I study. They're the type that live on the bottom of the seafloor. They secrete their calcium carbonate test or shell in equilibrium with seawater chemistry. So we can go out in the middle of the ocean, drill those sediments, and they will contain the tests of these long dead protists. We can take them back to our labs and we can acidify them and measure the different chemical compositions of their tests. So the benthic foraminifera are giving us a really good proxy through time, an estimate, if you will, of the amount of ice that was here on our Earth and the temperature. So you'll notice here on the right, there's cold and there's warm, so that's really all you need to know. At the bottom of this graph with the kind of red bar labeled species, you can see the different species of our ancestors and us and when we began to evolve. There's also major milestones. It's an interactive thing. It's a really great website, but we're not going to go through that. And then there's tons of millions of years on the bottom. So on the left, it goes from 8 billion years till today. And you'll notice the red box I've put around here where Homo sapiens evolved. So we evolved in a place that was relatively cooler. So this is a figure from Wikipedia that I've modified to be a little more digestible. What you're looking at on the y-axis here is temperature in degrees Celsius versus the 1960 to 1990 average, so another baseline. And what we're looking at is geologic time from 500 million years on the left to today on the right, so 0 million years. And notice again that temperature, just like CO2, has been much higher in the geologic past, and then it's slowly come down through time. But what I want you to look at is this box on the right that I've put a red box around. I've showed an arrow where we evolved 300 million years ago. And let's zoom into that box and look at it a little bit more. So this is the last 800,000 years of Earth's CO2 concentrations in parts per million. For the last 800,000 years, CO2 in the atmosphere has been between about 280 and 180 parts per million. Like Molly said earlier, it's never been above 300 parts per million during this time. Note where we evolved. We evolved here. So this is a time when Earth's CO2 was constrained very tightly, and CO2 fluctuations happened within 100 parts per million. This is where we are today. We're a tick over 420 parts per million, if not a little higher. I haven't checked it in a while. It kind of makes me depressed to look at it. But the main point that I want to make you aware of here, and this is a really good one, it's a really scary one too. Humans have never lived in a world with this high amount of atmospheric CO2. We did not evolve under these conditions. We've never experienced this before. So we were kind of running an experiment on ourselves. There are folks working on how this increase in atmospheric CO2 will affect us. And all the research doesn't point to great things. So we have to learn how to deal with this increased warming and increased atmospheric CO2. Okay, I'll stop there. That's for later.
All right.
Questions from the audience. So we have this one mic, so we're going to collect questions if you have them written down. Chilla and Sam, if does anybody have a question, you can just pass it to an end or hold it up in the air and somebody will come get it. If nobody has a question, I always have questions. Nobody has questions? Okay,
Do you know how far down that surface level ocean mix is? Is there any idea what the depth is on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the surface ocean is pretty thin. It can go down to about 200 to 300 meters. And then you really start to transition, and that transition zone is called the thermocline, and that's when you transition into the deep ocean. But depending where you are in the ocean, like the region, that surface ocean depth can change. Like in the western equatorial Pacific, it's very thick because the winds pile up all this warm water in the western equatorial Pacific. And the eastern equatorial Pacific, you hardly have any surface ocean there. So it's regionally variable as well. Great question.
If you have a question, just hold it up, we'll run over and grab something.
okay. Yes, can we sign a petition to stop AC in the bus and Science 1? It's too cold. We're working on this. Yes, thank you very much. I will, in fact, one of the things that we're probably going to be doing with the Binghamton 2 Degrees initiative is maybe experimenting with our thermostat a little bit to give people a feeling of what 2 degrees Celsius actually does feel like. And our energy use, and when we get to the very end, I have a slide of things that we can all do to help, with climate change. So, all right, another question. Will trees be able to migrate fast enough to survive?
That's a good question. Some trees probably will be able to. One good example of trees being able to migrate fast enough is that all of the trees we have up here in New York migrated at one time already, right? So there was a last glacial maximum, and about 18,000 years ago it receded. I think I'm getting that right, hopefully. And all of the trees that are currently here migrated up from the south. So there is precedence for it. But again, as I mentioned, there will be some winners and some losers, so it really depends on particular traits of that tree and how they're dispersed. That might allow some to move faster than others.
This is a good one, because so you touched on this briefly, Molly, but I am also curious about this. Why, again, is Antarctic melting affecting the northern hemisphere more?
Yeah.
That seems so counterintuitive.
Yeah. I'm just gonna go to this. So,
Thank you. So the whole premise is mass is attracted to mass, right? So when you have a large mass, it's actually attracting more mass to it. And because the ocean is a fluid, it's actually attracting that adjacent mass and as an ocean water towards it. So you actually have a local sea level rise around a margin that has a large ice mass. And when it loses that ice mass, it has less of a gravitational effect. It's actually the same principles of why we have spring and neap tides, right? When we have a really nice sun-moon alignment, right, you have more mass that is literally pulling the ocean in one direction. So when you lose ice mass from Antarctica, that mass gets displaced away from it.
does that make sense?
Yes. All right, what is time scavengers? Tell us a little bit more about time scavengers.
Oh, okay, cool, thanks for this question. So Time Scavengers is an educational website, but it's also grown into an organization that supports and advocates for the next generation of Earth stewards. So one of my good friends, Adriane Lam, who's one of the invertebrate museum collectors at University of Michigan, curators, not collectors, she's a collector too. Anyway, we put together this website around the 2016 election because we were really frustrated about how climate change and evolution were being talked about and portrayed in the media. And there's a lot of mis and disinformation surrounding it, those topics. So I had taken a paleoclimate course with a climate modeler who works on Antarctica, which Molly knows, and I think he's on the space project too. And he told me things about climate change, and I was like, whoa, this makes so much sense. Imagine if this were like digestible to the general public for folks that were not in university or didn't have like a really strong science background. So Jen and I wrote these series of climate change pages. All those equations that I scrolled through, they're actually on time scavengers. I break down and show how and why ocean acidification is happening and the chemistry behind it, for example. We explain the ocean mixing in layers and some other topics too. And then Jen talks about the fossil record in paleontology. We got more interest, and 2 years ago, we actually had enough folks that we made it a nonprofit organization. So Time Scavengers includes its static informational pages. We have 6 blogs where we talk about being a scientist and kind of pull back the curtain on life as a scientist and what we do. We also have 2 initiatives to support the next generation of Earth stewards. We have the Tilly Edinger Travel Grant, and it is a travel grant to get students and a vocational scientist to conferences. We pay the conference abstract fees and registration fees up front, because I'm a first-generation student. I did not come from a rich family or background, and money was always an issue. So we want to make these places more accessible and get as many folks in these spaces where they can have opportunities to network and learn and grow their careers as possible. And then we have VIP SciComm. It's virtual internship program for science communication. We won 3 grants to do that 2 years ago, and we paid 5 students to do a science communication internship with us. We paired them with a Time Scavengers team member. They wrote blog posts for the website that were published on the site that they could, their names were tagged on it. We brought in 5 speakers from all different types of backgrounds and experiences to talk about different aspects like accessibility, indigenous rights, and advocacy of water rights, such like that. So we're still trying to find more money so that we can keep doing these programs. It's our biggest thing right now, it always usually is. But we really want to turn to writing more static informational pages, because I find that I use them a lot in my teaching, and those are the pages that are actually getting a lot of hits by people all over the world. So thanks for asking that question.
So now we have a ton of questions and not a ton of time. So I'm gonna pick one out of here. And if you wrote a question and you want a personal response rather than just on the website, come up afterward, put your email address on here, and one of these wonderful women will make sure that you get an answer to your question. But the one I want to ask has to do with technology. Is technology going to save us?
Technology can help us. So technology is sort of what got us here in the first place, right? Innovations in technology made us create this amazing society we live in that is ultimately leading to climate change. So we have the ability for technology to help us. One example is just yesterday in the New York Times, I read about a relatively new technique in biology, gene editing, where scientists have now created drought-resistant watermelons and heat-resistant cherries using this cool gene editing technique. So there's one example about how technology can help us, and that we have the ability to help to mitigate the impacts of climate change and create sustainable communities.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Kristen. Technology got us here, and unfortunately it's geosciences that got us here with oil and drilling, but it can help get us out, and it's going to take everyone too. So there's this great article by Julie Brigham-Preddy. She's an Arctic researcher at UMass Amherst. She's a wonderful woman. But she wrote an article in The Hill called Don't Look Up North. And she wrote this when the Don't Look Up movie came out on Netflix. So these are some main points from her paper, because a lot of geoengineering focuses, like how to solve climate change and bring down CO2, focuses on the Arctic. It's a region of the world that's warming the fastest, or one of them. And these are the points. Most warming occurs, it is happening at the mid-latitudes. So we're transporting heat from the equatorial regions to the mid-latitudes and then the higher latitudes. So focusing just on the Arctic isn't going to work. There's heat being distributed across the world from the equator to these high latitudes. When we talk about injecting the atmosphere with sulfates and other stuff like that to block sunlight, we already know that has devastating effects, and we know that from looking at the fossil and sediment record in the past. That's not good. In addition, blocking that sunlight is a really short-term solution. It's only going to protect us for maybe 1 to 2 years, but it doesn't do anything to curb ocean acidification, which is like the silent sister to climate change, and it doesn't do anything to protect our ecosystems either. The last point here is a really important one. The Arctic is home to about 4 million indigenous humans, and they have not been involved as much as they should be and included in these conversations about climate change. So when we think about geoengineering and doing these things in the Arctic, these are people that have a say, and they need to have a say, and they need to be involved. And that goes for a lot of the most marginalized communities in the US and across the world when we talk about climate change. So we absolutely cannot treat them like a test for our solutions.
Yeah, so my husband is by training an economic geologist, and he's an environmental consultant because I moved him to the Northeast. You know, I talk with him a lot about this stuff, and you know, the irony is, like, you know, with green technologies, they need rare earth elements, right? And that's where probably the next big mining booms are going to be, in these rare earth elements, whether they're in the ocean or associated with volcanic systems. But the irony is they're going to need a lot of energy to get those mines built, to extract these resources for those green technologies. So that's always something I kind of think about, the amount of energy that's going to be required to actually get us to some of these resources and extract them for the future, like lithium batteries.
All right, before I turn it over to Leslie, what I'd like to end with, especially with my classes, because this can be a real downer topic, right? So I'm going to ask each of you just in very, very quickly, what, if anything, gives you hope?
I think what gives me hope is, again, sort of innovation. So we are innovative people, innovative society, and I think we can do things to help mitigate the impacts of climate change and to be able to adapt to it.
So I guess I have two parts real quick. But long term, right? I mean, humans are smart. We invented computers. We signed the Kyoto Protocol when it was needed. There was the Clean Water Act in the US, right, to make sure people were drinking clean water. I think when push comes to shove, there's enough smart, hardworking people. There's just a lot of really negative noise. And the second part is just, for me personally, like, I have two little kids, and that diagram that I showed you from the IPCC report really hits home to me, because, you know, I have to have hope. I have to be positive, and just raise two kids that are positive and are going to contribute to the world in a positive way and be aware. That is, to me, the most impactful way that, you know, I can have change.
Yeah, kind of similar. What gives me hope is that we can actually, like, it's my students. I walk into this classroom almost every day. I only teach Tuesday, Thursday, so like twice a week, really. But then I see like these bright students and that are all aware of the problems that we face and just don't know what to do sometimes. And they're really passionate about the earth, and it's like, dang, yeah. And I kind of like get my fuel from their fire and use that to like keep teaching the next generation. The other thing is that there's already a lot of resources out there, and there's a lot of folks already working together. So I don't want to leave this presentation without a list of things that you can do right now to address climate change and make you feel like you're part of it. Because a lot of times we do feel down and like, oh my God, this is a huge problem. Like, how do I combat this? But it takes all of us doing small actions, and every little action adds up to larger actions. So don't ever think whatever you're doing is useless. Everything matters. So there's some resources that we've compiled. If you scan the QR code, it will link you to a Google Doc, and those Google Docs have links on them for everything that I'm going to talk about. One of the apps I use is ResistBot, and this you can use to send letters to your elected officials at every level. There is research out of Yale that shows the most impactful thing that you can do to address climate change is interact with your elected officials and vote. So do that. A lot of folks don't do that. I did not do this until I was in my 30s, but those of you who are in your 20s, do it and talk to people about doing it. I just found this new app called Commons. It's a free app that helps you live a more sustainable lifestyle and like helps you, give you tips, tricks, and you can even, I think, like receive credit back or money for doing things. It's really kind of cool. Also, join a local climate focus group or community. Binghamton University has a sustainability hub, and they have a local organizations page. It's linked in that doc that I've made. You can also get involved with the climate movement. There's 350.org, Citizens Climate Lobby. All of those listed up there, they're all hyperlinked in that document. There's also a climate platform that was designed by Katherine Hayhoe. She's one of my climate change heroes. She's phenomenal. But she made this climate platform. There's also powerful steps that you can take to address climate change right now in your community. And one of the other powerful things you can do is educate yourself. So I've listed in a lot of readings. I've got lists in there by Black, Indigenous authors about environmentalism, environmental racism, and how we can address climate change and really address it through an equity lens. Okay, so I'll leave that up there for y'all to scan.
Okay, let's give applause, please. I'm going to turn it back over to Leslie, who's going to guide us through one more writing workshop. And then I'm going to actually flip this to another list of behaviors that you, from easy to hard, that you can engage in.
Okay, so just a couple more minutes. I want you to do two different things. So on the pink paper, as opposed to the purple paper, if you could just quickly jot down what your climate emotions, your dominant climate emotions are. So that can be anything from curiosity, hope, despair, depression, anxiety, just whatever you're feeling in response to any of the climate events, you know, from the past summer, anything you heard here, just whatever comes to mind. So just jot those down on the pink paper. And then also where in your body you feel those emotions. So I tend to feel everything in my stomach. So, where do you feel the particular emotions that you're feeling in relation to the climate? So that's the pink page. And what we would like you to do, if you would like, is leave these two pages with us on your way out. You could take a picture of it, so you have it like for your own records, but without your name. So if you would like to share these with us, just to give us a sense of how people are feeling, like what's important to you, we would really appreciate that, but you do not have to do that at all. If you'd be willing to, we'd love you to do that.
And because this is a research study, we actually have these, you don't have to sign anything, but we have to hand out the informed consent forms so that you can know what your rights are, because if we collect your writing sample, it is going to be used for research. But we would like you to take your name off of them. It's one of those things that we have to do when we're doing research that involves humans. So please take a look at it. If you have any questions, let me know. But yes, take the time to write, and when you're done, Chilla and Sam will collect your papers from you if you're willing to donate them to our project.
If for some reason you use the pieces of paper for something else and you do have a sheet available to you, the first writing workshop you can label as part 1, and then this one you can label as part 2.
Then you add another thing. You don't try to do them all at once, or you get frustrated. You feel hopeless. You don't want to go on. So just these are some things that we're going to be talking about throughout the year. Simple things to the harder things that you can do to help prevent climate change. And then before you leave, we would like you to take a short survey. It does take less than 1 minute. You can scan this with your phone, and it will take you to the survey page. It's only 8 questions. And finally, again, if you gave us a question and you want a personalized answer and you would like to give us your email address, I have your questions right up here. So everybody, thank you for attending. Really appreciate you all turning out on this evening. Remember to continue to talk about climate change with people as often as you can. Binghamton 2 Degrees is an initiative that you'll be hearing a lot about throughout the year. Come to more events, participate, give us your ideas. We really feel that this is a community initiative. It's not just being run by a few faculty members. So yeah, thank you and have a great evening.